Sylvia Brandt kept her mother's sewing kit in a shoebox under the bed. Not because she needed it. She didn't sew. She hadn't touched it in 11 years. But every time she thought about throwing it out, she would open the lid, smell the cedar blocks her mother used to tuck inside, and close it again. That was the one thing Kevin never found. Everything else he took. The house on Moncton Street, the one Sylvia had cleaned and painted and recaulked every autumn for 9 years, went to him in the settlement. The car, a Subaru she had driven to every school pickup and grocery run and 6 a.m. dentist appointment, went with it. The joint savings account, which held $42,000 the last time Sylvia checked, was emptied 11 days before Kevin filed the paperwork. She didn't know about the emptying until a week after the filing. Her lawyer at the time, a young man who seemed perpetually apologetic, explained that Kevin's lawyer had been very thorough. That was the word he used. Thorough. Sylvia was 51 years old when she signed the divorce papers. She sat in a beige office in downtown Moncton and held the pen for a long time before she used it. Outside the window, pigeons moved along a ledge. A bus pulled away from the stop. Someone honked. The world kept moving the way it always does, indifferent to whatever is happening to you inside a beige office on a Tuesday afternoon. She signed. She walked out with a bag of clothes, her mother's sewing kit, and $280 in a checking account Kevin hadn't known about. She had opened it 7 years earlier. Not because she suspected anything, but because her mother had always told her to keep something for yourself. Not a lot, just something. Sylvia had put $20 in when she opened it and forgotten about it until it had quietly grown to $280. Her mother was gone by then, had been for 3 years, so she couldn't tell her she had been right. Sylvia's daughter, Renee, was 23 and living in Halifax. She called the night after the signing. "Mom, come here. Come stay with me. I'm not going to Halifax." "Why not?" Sylvia looked around the room she was renting, a bachelor unit above a Vietnamese restaurant on St. George Street, $40 a week, hot plate included. "Because I'm not running," she said. Renee was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's not running. That's just coming home. Moncton is home." It wasn't a defiant thing to say. It was just true. Sylvia had lived in Moncton since she was 19. She had met Kevin here. She had buried her mother here. She had watched her daughter grow up here. She didn't know how to be herself somewhere else. And she wasn't ready to find out. She stayed. The first week was bad in the way that first weeks usually are. Not dramatic, just heavy. She woke up in a room that wasn't hers, in a bed that smelled like someone else's fabric softener, and she lay there looking at the water stain on the ceiling and tried to figure out what came next. The hot plate worked. The bathroom was shared with the man down the hall, a retired CN rail worker named George, who nodded to her in the mornings and never asked questions. She was grateful for that. She had worked for 17 years as an office administrator for a plumbing supply company. She had given that up 12 years into the marriage, when Kevin said it made more sense for one of them to be home, and he was making enough, and she agreed, because she had believed him when he said things like that. She had believed most of what Kevin said for a long time. After the divorce, she applied to 3 places in her first week: a dental clinic, a logistics company, a small accounting firm. All 3 said they were looking for someone with more recent experience. She applied to 4 more. 2 didn't call back. 1 offered her minimum wage for full-time work. 1 wanted to interview her but asked her to come in at 8 a.m. on a Monday. And she showed up to find they had already filled the position over the weekend, and no one had bothered to tell her. She had $220 left by the end of the second week. She did not call Renee and say any of this. What she did instead was start cooking. Not for anyone in particular, just for something to do, because she had always cooked, and the hot plate in her room allowed for enough. She made a pot of chowder one evening, the recipe her mother's mother had made, the one Sylvia had written down on an index card when she was 16, because she was afraid of forgetting it. It wasn't an extravagant chowder. Corn and potato and a bit of smoked haddock, seasoned exactly the way her grandmother had shown her. She sat on the edge of the bed and ate it out of the pot because she only had one bowl and she didn't want to wash it twice. George knocked on her door that night. She opened it and he looked at her and then passed her at the hot plate and said, very simply, "That smells incredible." She gave him a bowl. He came back 20 minutes later with the bowl cleaned and said, "I would pay real money for that." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in 2 weeks. But she thought about what he said. The next morning she called the events coordinator at the farmer's market on Main Street. The coordinator's name was Janet. Brisk, efficient, 2 questions asked and done. There was a vendor spot available Saturdays and Sundays. The fee was $25 a weekend. Sylvia said she would take it. She spent $40 on supplies. She had a large pot, a folding table that the previous tenant had left behind, and 3 mismatched thermoses she found at Value Village for $2 each. She made chowder and a Acadian meat pie, tourtière the way her mother made it, with pork and potato, and a crust that took 3 attempts before she got it right again. And she wrapped everything carefully and took the bus to the market at 6:30 on a Saturday morning in November, which in Moncton means your breath fogs and your fingers go numb before you've finished setting up. She sold out in 2 hours, not because she was running some brilliant operation. She had a handwritten sign, a pot on a portable burner she borrowed from George, and a price of $8 a bowl. People stopped because it was cold outside and it smelled good. They came back a second time because it tasted the way something should taste when someone actually cares about making it. By 10:30, she had $64 in a tin box and an empty pot and a woman in a red parka who pressed her card into Sylvia's hand and said, "I need to know if you do catering." Sylvia drove home on the bus. She didn't have a car, remember, with the empty pot on her lap, and sat in her room for a long time just thinking. She thought, "I can do this." She called Renee that night. "I'm going to start a food business," she said. Renee was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then, "Okay, tell me everything." That was how it started. Not with a plan, not with capital or a business loan or any kind of formal structure. It started with $64 and a borrowed burner and a woman in a red parka who turned out to be the events coordinator for the Moncton Hospital Foundation's annual gala. The gala was 86 people. Sylvia had never catered anything in her life. She spent a week developing a menu that worked within her budget and her equipment limits. She called in a favor from a woman named Donna, who had been her neighbor on Moncton Street, and who had nothing to do with Kevin. Donna showed up with her own roasting pans and spent 12 hours in Sylvia's kitchen, by which point the kitchen was actually a rented space in a church hall that allowed commercial cooking on weekends for a modest fee. The gala went well, not perfectly. One of the soups went tepid in transit, and Sylvia spent 20 minutes apologizing to the venue coordinator, who turned out not to care, but well enough that 2 people asked for her card. She didn't have cards yet. She wrote her number on the back of a paper napkin. Both of them called. Kevin found out through his sister, Margot. Margot and Sylvia had never been close, but they had been civil, in the way that people are civil when there is a man between them who requires it. After the divorce, Margot went quiet the way most of Kevin's people did, but she had a daughter who used Instagram, and Sylvia had made an Instagram account at Renee's insistence. And somewhere in that chain of connection, Margot saw a photo of Sylvia's chowder at the farmer's market captioned with the words, "Sold out 2 weeks running." Margot called Kevin. Kevin, by this point, was living in the Moncton Street house with a woman named Trish, who was younger than Renee by 4 years. Sylvia knew this not because she followed him, but because Moncton is not a large city, and people tell you things whether you want to know them or not. She did not think much about Kevin at this point. She was too busy to think about Kevin. She was up at 4 most mornings, working recipes, calculating costs, returning emails on her phone while standing in line at the grocery store. She had opened a business account with $312 and a name she had submitted to the province of New Brunswick, Brant Kitchen. She had not asked Kevin's permission to use her own last name. The problem, if it could be called a problem, though later Sylvia would call it something less polite, was that Kevin had, in the year leading up to the divorce, quietly repositioned certain assets. The house had been refinanced. The savings account had been restructured into a joint investment account, and then dissolved, with Kevin's lawyer processing the paperwork in a way that was technically legal and practically devastating. There was a company, a numbered company Kevin had registered in his own name, that Sylvia's lawyer had missed in the settlement because Kevin's lawyer had been very thorough and Sylvia's lawyer had been very apologetic. What that company held, among other things, was the rights to a catering business license Kevin had registered 18 months before the divorce. He had registered it in Moncton. He had listed Sylvia's mother's address as the business address, using information he had pulled from documents in their shared home office. He had never operated the business. He had simply held the license, and when Brandt Kitchen began to grow, Kevin's lawyer sent Sylvia a letter, noting that her operation appeared to be in conflict with an existing registered license held by Kevin's numbered company, and suggesting that they discuss compensation. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Sylvia read it at the kitchen table of the church hall, between batches of butter tarts for a law firm's holiday party. She put the letter face down on the table. She finished the butter tarts. Then she called a different lawyer. This one was not apologetic. Her name was Beverly Cote, and she had been practicing family and business law in Moncton for 22 years. Beverly read the letter, asked 4 questions, and said, "He doesn't have a claim, but he'll try to make one expensive. So let's make it more expensive for him." This is the part of the story that takes a while to tell because the law takes a while to move. Beverly filed a motion. Kevin's lawyer filed a counter motion. There were 3 months of correspondence that Sylvia was mostly shielded from, because Beverly told her very clearly, "Let me handle the letters. You focus on the business." So Sylvia focused on the business. By the following April, Brandt Kitchen had catered 11 events, supplied 4 local restaurants with daily soup orders, and been written up in a small piece in the Times transcript under the headline, "Local Woman Brings Maritime Comfort Food Back to the Table." It was a short piece. 12 paragraphs. A photo of Sylvia standing behind a pot of chowder in the church hall kitchen, wearing an apron her daughter had sent from Halifax that said absolutely nothing clever, just her name stitched in blue thread. Renee drove up from Halifax the weekend the piece ran. They sat at a table in the church hall after a Saturday service emptied out and ate the leftover butter tarts, and Renee held the printed paper in both hands like it was something that might disappear. "Mom," she said. "Don't make it a thing," Sylvia said. "It's a thing." Sylvia looked at the photo for a moment. She didn't look like a woman who had come through something. She looked like a woman who was in the middle of something. She thought that was probably accurate. The legal matter resolved that June. What Beverly found, and this is the part where Kevin's plan unraveled the way poorly made things eventually do, was that the numbered company Kevin had used to register the catering license had been set up using a fraudulent civic address. Sylvia's mother's address, which had been her mother's address, and which Kevin had never had legal standing to use. The registration was voided. The numbered company was subject to a penalty review for the misuse of a civic registration. Kevin's lawyer filed 2 more letters and then went quiet. Kevin called Sylvia directly, once. She did not recognize the number. She picked up. "I just want to talk," he said. "About what?" she asked. He started to say something about how things had gotten out of hand, about how he hadn't meant, and she waited for him to finish the sentence, but he didn't finish it. He let it trail off in the way people do when they know that whatever comes next will sound worse than the silence. "Okay," she said, and she hung up. She put the phone on the counter and stood there for a moment in the kitchen that smelled like pastry and stock and the coffee she had been drinking since 6 in the morning. Then she went back to work. By autumn, Brandt Kitchen had a proper commercial space, a small unit in a building on Cameron Street. Nothing remarkable, a stainless steel counter and a walk-in fridge and a second-hand convection oven she had bought from a restaurant that was closing. She hired 2 people, a young woman named Priya who had just finished culinary school and needed her first real job, and a man named Terence who had been cooking in institutional kitchens for 15 years and was tired of it. They worked well together. They argued sometimes about technique. Sylvia stayed out of it unless the result was wrong. The Times and transcript piece had been picked up by a regional food blog. The blog piece had been seen by a producer at a CBC New Brunswick segment called Roots and Recipes, which ran Thursday evenings and featured stories about maritime food culture. The producer, a woman named Allison, emailed Sylvia in August to ask if she would be interested in being featured. Sylvia said she would think about it. She thought about it for 10 days and then said yes. The filming took a full day. Allison and a crew of 2 came to the Cameron Street kitchen on a Wednesday in October, when the light through the small windows was that particular October light that makes everything look like something worth keeping. They filmed Sylvia making chowder. They filmed her rolling out the tourtière crust. They filmed her reading the index card with her grandmother's recipe, though they didn't zoom in close enough to read the writing, which was fine. Some things are private. Allison asked her, at one point, whether she had expected any of this. Sylvia thought about it honestly before she answered. "No," she said. "I thought I was just trying not to go under." "And now?" She looked around the kitchen. Priya was labeling containers in the walk-in. Terence was breaking down boxes by the back door. The convection oven was running. Everything was running. "Now," she said, "I think I'm actually swimming." The segment aired on a Thursday in November. Renee watched it in Halifax. George, the retired CN rail worker, watched it in his room above the Vietnamese restaurant, which Sylvia knew because he texted her afterward. His first text to her ever, written with no punctuation and in all lowercase, which read simply, "Watched it." "Very good, Sylvia." She sat on the edge of her bed, a different bed now, in a proper apartment on Church Street, and read that text and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not pride, not relief, something quieter. Something like the feeling of getting to the other side of a thing and realizing the other side exists. Donna, who had spent 12 hours in that church hall kitchen making soup for 86 people at a hospital gala, called her the next morning. They were friends by now, properly, in the way you become friends with someone after something difficult. Kevin saw the segment, Donna said. Sylvia had expected this. Moncton was not a large city. How do you know? Because Margot posted something online and then deleted it, but not before Margot's daughter saw it. Sylvia waited. "He looks rough," Donna said. "From what I hear, the thing with Trish isn't going well, and there's some issue with the house." Apparently the refinancing terms were a lot more aggressive than he realized. Sylvia thought about Kevin calling her and not finishing his sentence. She thought about a man who had spent 14 months quietly building a cage for someone and then seemed surprised when the person found a door he hadn't noticed. "I don't wish him anything," she said finally. "Good or bad. I just don't think about him anymore." This was true. It had taken a while to be true, but it was true now. Renee drove up for Christmas that year. They cooked together in the apartment on Church Street. The old chowder recipe, the tourtière, a dark molasses cake that Sylvia's mother used to make for every holiday without fail. The shoebox with the sewing kit sat on the shelf in the bedroom. Sylvia had taken it out once since she moved into the apartment, opened it, smelled the cedar, closed it again. She hadn't needed to take the lid off since. After dinner, Renee cleared the table while Sylvia stood at the kitchen window with a cup of tea and looked out at the street. The snow was coming down lightly, the kind of snow that doesn't accumulate so much as just remind you that the world is still there, still turning, still dropping something quiet on the rooftops. "What was the hardest part?" Renee asked, not in a heavy way, just genuinely wanting to know. Sylvia thought about it. Not the legal fight, not the money, though the money had been very bad. Not even the first weeks in the room above the restaurant. The not knowing, she said, what I was going to be on the other side. And now you know. She looked at her daughter, who had her grandmother's eyes and her own stubbornness, and had driven 4 hours through December weather to eat chowder in a small apartment in Moncton. "I'm figuring it out," Sylvia said. "That's enough." There are people who will tell you that stories like this one have a clean ending, that justice arrives in a satisfying shape, that the person who lost everything gets it back exactly as it was. That's not what happened here. Sylvia Brandt didn't get the house on Marchand Street back. She didn't get the years. She didn't get to unlearn the particular kind of sadness that comes from discovering that someone you built a life with was, somewhere underneath it all, building something else. What she got was this: a kitchen on Cameron Street that smelled like chowder and butter tarts and the first serious work of her own life. A daughter who drove through snow to eat dinner with her. A retired CN rail worker who texted in all lowercase. A lawyer named Beverly who made the expensive thing go away. $280 that became something she couldn't have predicted. On the afternoon, she signed her name in a beige office, while pigeons moved along a ledge outside. A shoebox under a bed that she no longer needed to open just to remember who she was. People ask, sometimes, whether she would have done anything differently. Whether she would have seen it coming. Whether she would have kept the job, kept the savings account, kept some version of herself that didn't depend on what Kevin said next. She answers honestly when people ask. "Probably not," she says. "I trusted him. I thought that was the right thing to do. And I think I'd probably do that again. I'd just know to keep the $20. She means the checking account. The one she opened because her mother told her to keep something for yourself. Not a lot. Just something. It's not a lesson that fits on a card. It's not a warning you can paste on the wall. It's just the thing she knows now. The way you know things that have been learned from the ground up, through your hands, through years of mornings, through an index card with a soup recipe written in a 16-year-old's careful handwriting. You keep something for yourself. And when everything else is gone, you find out what that something is.